Well, it's quite an entrance this morning. A lot of fun to participate in things like that, isn't it? I like the excitement. Sometimes I know I'm a bit of a man because I like action movies too. I like things with excitement and stories and anticipation and a little bit of unsureness about what's going to happen. And it got me thinking a little bit about where we're at in the story of God today, in the life of Jesus. We saw this past Christmas season how when God puts on a drama, it's definitely something that we want to come and see. And we considered that from different angles and who the people were and what a great drama God was putting on. And here it is, the culmination of his life. As we go from his birth and Christmas now to Passion Week and continuing to celebrate the death and then the resurrection of Jesus, we can see and know kind of where the story is going. But if we pause for a moment right here, it leaves us in a bit of an awkward place. I was kind of thinking about that this week. There's a lot of movies that I like that are action movies, and today a lot of those superhero movies have become popular, haven't they? There's used to be just Superman and things like that, right? And now, how many movies are there? I mean, every year there's more Marvel comic movies and all these superheroes and all that stuff, and they're becoming more and more popular, it seems, at least in Hollywood. So, it leaves us kind of with the question, what do we like about those stories? Why are they selling? Why is it so popular? Do you guys have any ideas?
Good win.
Good wins. Wow. All right.
They're exciting.
They're exciting.
Really, like,
Yeah, they're heroes. Mm-hmm.
always a hero.
Help in time of need, maybe? Yeah, good overcoming evil. Are there any instances where the hero doesn't win? Just for momentarily. Sometimes that's what we like about the story, right? You get caught in and here comes the hero. He's going to save the day. All of a sudden all this stuff happens. There's trials, there's tribulations, there's things that come along the way that kind of affect things, right? It makes for an interesting story. I noticed recently as we watched the movie Noah that they teased out the story quite a bit in the middle when the guys were on the ark. And there was a whole bunch of stuff that they added to the story to make it more interesting, and it was a bunch of drama. But isn't that what we like? It kind of makes it a good movie that way, because you don't know how things are going to end, and you can't understand how the story is going to play out. So it kind of gets you going. There's this buildup of intensity, and then all of a sudden, of course, the ending happens, and good wins usually. But I got to thinking, what would happen in some of these stories if it just stopped in the middle and that was the end of the movie? What if it was like Superman back in the day? He flies in on the scene where horrible things are happening and they need him to be somebody, and like immediately he gets shot and dies. If I was in a movie theater and I saw something like that, I would be pretty upset, right? I'd demand my money back. I'd say, that's a horrible story. What? I leave the theater feeling like I can't have hope in anything. What is this? The superhero died. It just seems kind of ridiculous. And to my recollection, there's not a whole lot of movies like that. I know I've seen a couple because I know I've had that feeling, but they were more dramatic, real-life kind of stories, and sometimes you just can't change the way that plays out, or has played out in history. So it's rather interesting, I think, we get back to the story of what God is doing, and the story of the gospel. Today we celebrated the triumphal entry of our King into Jerusalem. That's what we celebrate on Palm Sunday. He had declared himself to be the Messiah. People knew it from the miracles he had been doing, and they welcomed him in as a king. They laid their coats down. They laid the palm fronds down. They said, King, come into our city. We recognize you as Messiah. You are the leader, the one we've been looking forward to for now several thousand years. The culmination of all things. What a high time it was for them. Now, the scriptures say that he was riding a donkey, and probably the colt of a donkey. So, what does that symbolize? Does anybody remember? Humility? Yes. And peace. If he came to fight, he would have been riding a trusty steed, a giant horse, carrying a sword and other things probably. And for some reason, I always think of the Egyptian thing where there should have been people carrying him and he's sitting on this magnificent throne or something like that with people waving palm fronds at him so he doesn't get too hot. I don't know, that's just what I have in my head. Maybe Hollywood kind of puts that in us. But here it was, he comes in a humble way on this colt of a donkey as a sign of peace coming into the city. He's not coming to start a fight. He's not coming for war. He's coming for peace. The people were expecting him to usher in his kingdom. And that's what they had been looking forward to and what they were expecting him to do when he got in Jerusalem. Here he comes in on about Sunday, and now we catch up with him later and all sort of Friday. We get caught in the middle. If we stop the story where the gospel stopped today in that reading, you have to imagine the disappointment on the people's faces, in their minds, in their hearts. Here the Jewish people, the people of God, who had long since looked forward to this promise, one we've studied quite in depth on Tuesday mornings. I mean, for quite a while. We now understand much better the history of what was going on in the world and how the Jewish people had always looked forward to better times, especially when hard times had come. And they were always looking forward to having a land and their own little special people group so they could effectually, be a blessing to other people. But they always understood that when the Messiah would come, he was going to usher in their kingdom and give them a land again so they could have their own people. The Jews at the time that this was going on had to feel a little bit awkward because although they had their own stuff going on, the Romans were in charge. It wasn't their land. They were just kind of allowed to be there, and there was a lot of other people there as well. Now, if we stop the story here, I think it would leave us in that middle awkward spot. And I think that was the disappointment that the people were feeling. They had these expectations about when Messiah comes, it's going to be like this. And they probably told their kids and in a way fantasized about it and talked about it and said, I wonder if it's going to be like this, or do you think he's going to do this, or how do you think he's going to deal with Pontius Pilate and these other leaders? I imagine at some point they had to have some kind of conversations about it. They had these ideas in their head and what they thought they had read in the scriptures and what they thought that meant. And so when it played out this way, I kind of get that feeling like Superman just landed and that was it. Like he had all this hope and then it just crashed. They're going, what's going on? He's going to die a criminal's death. The trials that they had before him, before this, that we didn't read about, were the religious trials, where their biggest problem with Jesus was he claimed to be the Son of God, which was blasphemy. To claim to be as high as God. Now, when they got to this other court, they had to come up with something else, because that wasn't a real thing that they tried him for. So they were saying, he's the king of the Jews, which means he's a threat to Caesar. So Pontius Pilate should get worried. He's maybe a threat to the authority there. Now, we already know the religious leaders had an issue with Jesus because he had a way of pointing out their faults and embarrassing them and making them look silly in front of the people, and they enjoyed a certain amount of clout and status in society. And when it came to the other leaders, they didn't always like the way people got stirred up around Jesus. They may not have directly had a problem with him, but they didn't like the effect that he often had, which is one where we see now a riot has started. Pontius Pilate seems to me like a very reasonable man. He knows what's going on. He's able to see the truth. And I think he makes several concessions to the crowd to try to release Jesus. Because he knows he's innocent. And if that weren't enough in and of itself, apparently God gave him this amazing wife who was able to speak truth into his life. And what does she tell him? Leave this guy alone. I had dreams about him last night. He's innocent. Let him go. But he didn't listen to the wise counsel of his wife, did he? He allowed the crowd to persuade him. And the history says that Pontius Pilate had a little bit of trouble because he was always trying to maintain order. He didn't want there to be anything but peace, because that's what Rome wanted. He only had at most a cohort of soldiers around, 200 men or so. He didn't have a large army, so if order broke out, they'd have to send more troops, and then the guys would get upset. He would look bad. It would be bad for his career. It would be bad for his face. He wouldn't be able to be the strong leader, the man that everybody wanted him to be, and that he enjoyed the reputation of being. He wouldn't appear to be able to maintain control over his people. So he kind of gave in to the crowd, even though he knew it wasn't right. And he tried to hand Jesus back over, and what happens? They crucified him anyway. The soldiers did it. I think right about this time, most of the people were just feeling that disappointment as if, wow, I thought it was going to be this, and now this is happening. I don't get it. I thought this great things were going to happen, and then here he is. He's getting beat up, and he looks like he's about to die because they're sending him off to be crucified. What happened? Our hopes and dreams are smashed. The story doesn't appear to be ending well at all. I think, boy, that's not a place to be. But I think from that, we can draw a tremendous application for our lives, even if we pause the story right there. If we start to ask ourselves questions about what expectations have I had of God and of Jesus, and what he was going to do and be in my life, and how have those things been unfulfilled in some ways? Have I conjured up my own ideas? Have I thought ahead of time that this is how God's going to do this? Or it should work out like this, or I should just pray and the magic's going to happen. Or surely if God were around, he wouldn't allow suffering or this pain or this hardship that I've gone through or that I'm going through. And so often I think we face the harsh reality that that's just not the case. So what else are we to do if we don't just give up and say, wow, that's kind of a bummer story, isn't it? I think we can look forward to the days to come because we know how the story's going to end. We know that God's kingdom was being ushered in. It just didn't mean it was through the Messiah and as the king. It means that because he was crucified as a perfect sinless man, the Lamb of God, the fulfillment of all things told about in the Old Testament, prophesied about in hundreds of ways. When he hung on that cross, he would satisfy God's wrath forever, so we would never have to worry about being able to have a good relationship with God because of our imperfections. In other words, by the story happening in this particular way, this one time in history, for all time in history, furthermore, he could be the hero. This is the one struggle, the one bummer part, the one point where the drama comes into play. The story's not over. Although it appears dark and gloomy according to their history and our history, looking back, seeing how the story's going to finish, it's a glory to God. Because he not only changes chapters, he changes books. And he rewrites the whole story forever. So that we can always be confident that we are loved and accepted because of God's grace, because his son hung on that cross. And not only that, he was born again. And not only that, he sent the Spirit to live in us so that we could be empowered to, in effect, be many superheroes, if you will. Many heroes. We have the power of God living in us and the Holy Spirit that we can avail to do his good works on this earth. And all of a sudden, we start joining in the works of our superhero, Jesus, if you will. We're able to join in that. And that's a thing that's given to us. And I think if there's any challenge that comes from the season of Lent ending, it's to either not stop the new disciplines you've taken on or the things you've stopped doing and seeking God with renewed vigor. And if you have, or you've forgotten about that because it's been 30-some days now, well, maybe it's time to renew that. And say, I don't need just a special season like Lent to happen in order for me to draw near to God, to get into the Scriptures, and to remind myself of who God is according to God's terms and not mine. Oh, but that takes some humility. I believe that's a humility we see in our King, riding on a colt, coming in and ushering peace, and not fighting against these things that were happening in his life. Where he could have easily at any time just called down angels, just done anything he wanted. He had all the power available to him that he needed. He chose to humble himself, go through this process, even after asking his Father many times, let this cup pass. This is going to be a horrible thing. But if there's no other way, I'll do it. And he did it for us. Let's make that decision today. Whatever's in our hearts and in our minds that we've expected God to be and he's not been, let's submit to who he is. Let's try to get in the Bible and get into some readings and some accountability with others and say, God, I want to seek you afresh on your terms and not mine. Help me to understand who you are. And through that, I believe we'll begin to realize that he is fully sufficient for everything. He is the fulfillment of everything that we long for in our lives. Sometimes I think the greatest lesson we need to remember is that ultimately, like we see in this story and many others, Before things get better, sometimes they get worse. There's times of hardship. There's times of trouble. The Bible makes it clear that those are the times that should be growing our character to be more like Jesus. And we can trust in him that ultimately he's working out things for his good. And he's going to overcome. And that's where our hope lies. And that's why we can have joy, even in those times, let alone the good times. In our society, sometimes I fear that it's the hardships of life that draw us closer to God because we feel our need for him. And it's my truest desire and prayer that not only during seasons of Lent, but also during times of great joy and celebration in our lives, that we would choose to seek God and strive for him and pray for him just like we do when we're hurting and we have no other place to go. So let's go out today and celebrate this Holy Week with a renewed vigor, knowing that Jesus is who we need in our lives, and that he overcomes the world. Amen.
Amen.